My name's Graham. Like Mike said, I run Float On down in Portland, Oregon, which is actually the largest float center in the United States, which makes it my pleasure to now be presenting at the largest float center in Canada. And yeah, thank you so much too to Mike and Andy for hosting me out here and being a part of the book tour. It's been great. This is actually my fourth stop on the tour. Before this, I kind of toured around through Washington at some float centers down there, heading up here. And so I actually usually like to start, how many people here haven't floated before? Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, I haven't had a presentation yet where it's just all floaters. How many people here know much about John Lilly? Okay, how many here have actually read one of his books, or a couple of his books? Okay, great, that's awesome. The last presentation I gave, no one really knew anything about John Lilly, which is also kind of nice, because they can't correct me when I get my facts wrong. So, let me start by just introducing what we're up to a little bit with this book tour. And really what we're trying to do is just get this guy, Dr. John Lilly, in front of a whole new generation, and hopefully in front of a lot more eyeballs of people who will appreciate him. And the book, Programming and Metaprogramming, the Human Biocomputer, was originally published back in the 60s and largely based off of research that was done in the 50s, so 53 through 58. And the original printing was only 1,000 copies on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, pretty much mimeographed copies. And then after that, there was a 2,000 copy run that was really similar. And after that, it got picked up by a small press called the Julian Press. And then it got picked up by Bantam in the 70s and got kind of a larger run. And then re-picked up by Julian, or just reprinted by them. And after that, went silent pretty much and hasn't been published in its entirety for the last 25 years, which I think is a shame. If you want to get a full copy of it, you have to go on Abe's Books and pay $60 to $100 to get his original text right now. And we'll be selling this one for $19.95, which is my great pleasure. So what has been out there is another copy of the book, which is an abridged version of this one, which not only abridges it, but actually adds in extra content and just kind of changes it around. You can hop on Amazon if you're curious. That one's just called Programming and the Human Biocomputer, and is worth taking a look at the Amazon reviews if you're interested in that one. But without getting into too much detail, I am very proud to actually release the complete unabridged work. And we have some nice afterwords in here too. John Lilly has been hugely influential, not just in the float industry in my own life, but he's touched a lot of people throughout his very long life. And some of those have been reaching out to me, hearing that I've been publishing this book, which was an unexpected side benefit. So Glenn Perry, founder of the Samadhi Tank Company, wrote an afterwords for this. Craig Inglis, who John Lilly mentions in The Scientist as his liaison for float tanks, wrote an afterword. John actually officiated his wedding. Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, if you're familiar with MAPS, wrote an afterword that he actually considers this one of the two main books that was his inspiration for founding MAPS, and had the good fortune too of coming up to promote it at a conference up here in Vancouver a couple weeks ago. So that's a little bit of the story of the book, and our goal with this is actually to get it onto the Amazon bestseller list, which has its own set of procedures that you try to match. So for Amazon specifically, they don't count pre-orders towards launch day. So the goal with our book launch is really to try to get as many unique orders of the book to come from as many geographically diverse locations and credit cards and IP addresses as possible, since they don't want you just buying 1,000 copies yourself and pushing it up to the bestseller. They don't count that. So on May 15th, we'll be releasing this book. When it comes out on Amazon, it'll be $13. And that'll go up to $19.95 after the launch day. But again, my goal will be to actually get you guys to hop on May 15th and buy a copy of this book. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to be totally transparent that this is also a pitch, but hopefully a pitch that is worth listening to. So I usually like to start out with reading John Lilly's own introduction to this, and it gives a little bit of a history for the work. So this is the foreword to the second edition. And this was written in 1972, is when John Lilly wrote this, so about 5 years after the book originally came out. This work has a curious history. It was written as a final summary report to a government agency, National Institute of Mental Health, concerning 5 years of my life work. The agency paid my salary for those 5 years. It was conceived from a space rarer these days than it was then, the laws suspending scientific interest, research, involvement, and decisions about dilysergic acid diethylamide tartrate were passed just as this particular work was completed. The researchers were inadequately consulted, put down in fact. The legislators composed laws in an atmosphere of desperation. The National Negative Program on LSD was launched. LSD was the big scare, on par with war, pestilence, and famine, as the destroyer of young minds, brains, and fetuses. In this atmosphere, 66 to 67, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer was written. The work and its notes are dated from 64 to 66. The conception was formed in 1949, when I was first exposed to computer design ideas by Britton Chance. I coupled these ideas back to my own software through the atmosphere of my neurophysiological research on the cerebral cortex. I was more fully elaborated in the tank isolation solitude and confinement work at NIMH from 1953 to 58, run in parallel with the neurophysiological research on the rewarding and punishing systems in the brain. The Dolphin research was similarly born in the tank, with brain electrode results as parents in the further conceptions. While I was writing this work, I was a bit too fearful to express candidly in writing the direct experience uninterpreted. I felt a group of 30-person salaries, a large research budget, a whole institute's life depended on me and what I wrote. If I wrote the data up straight, I would have rocked the boats of several lives, colleagues and family, beyond my own stabilizer effectiveness threshold, I hypothesized, which is a classic John Lilly sentence if you've read him before. Despite my precautionary attitude, the circulation in 67 of this work contributed to the withdrawal of research funds in 68 from the research program on dolphins by one government agency. I've heard several negative stories regarding my brain and mind altered by LSD. At this point, I closed the institute and went to the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center to resume LSD research under government auspices. I introduced the ideas and work at the MPRC researchers I left for the Esalen Institute in 69. At Esalen, my involvement in direct human gut-to-gut communication and lack of involvement in administrative responsibility brought my courage to the sticking place. Meanwhile, Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Truck Catalog, Menlo Park, California, reviewed the work in the Whole Earth Catalog from a mimeographed copy I'd given W.W. Harmon of Stanford for his SUFIC purposes. Stuart wrote me asking for copies to sell. I had 300 printed photo offset from the typed copy. He sold them in a few weeks and asked for permission to reprint on newsprint an enlarged version at a lower price. Skeptical about saleability, I agreed. Book People Berkeley arranged the reprinting. Several thousand copies were sold. I had written the report in such a way that its basic messages were hidden behind a long, heavy introduction designed to stop the usual reader. Apparently, once word got out, this device no longer stalled interested readers. Somehow, the basic messages were important enough to enough readers so that the work acquired an unexpected viability. Thus, it seems appropriate to reprint it in full. On several different occasions, I've been asked to rewrite this work. One such start at rewrite ended up as another book, The Center of the Cyclone. Another start is evolving into my book number 5, Simulations of God, A Science of Belief. It seems as if this older work is a disseminating source for other works and solidly resists revision. To me, it is a thing separate from me, a record from a past space, a doorway into new spaces through which I passed and cannot return. John C. Lilly, February 7th, 1972, Los Angeles, California. And so I like to read that for a couple of reasons. One, it saves me from giving an introduction when John's done it so well in his own words. Two, it lets you know that if you're reading this book, you should really probably skip the introduction at first and skip straight to chapter 1, which I hadn't realized when I first picked it up. I have this rule where I never read forewords or prefaces to books before I read the book because I don't want the author to ruin it for me, so I always go back and read them afterwards. And as a result, the first 3 times that I tried to make it through this book, I just got stalled in that introduction, just like he said, and I was like, what are you talking about, John Lilly? You're so dense and confusing. And on the 4th try, I finally pushed through it and made it all the way through the book. And then I went back and read the forewords, and right there he's just like, just skip the introduction. It's really crazy. So it's good to read that for you guys too. I also recommend the first time picking it up, and it's worth rereading a few times and revisiting. But the first time, I recommend really reading it through and letting your brain kind of skim past the parts that don't grab your attention and latch onto the ones that do. John Lilly has a lot of really, really interesting things to say, and he is way smarter than you or I, most likely, certainly than me. And some of his language just gets really dense, and until you really start absorbing his language, he talks about programming and metaprogramming and super self metaprograms and super species metaprograms and his biocomputer and software and hardware. And until you understand what he means, I think it's almost better to let your brain skip over some of that stuff. So just a little warning too when you pick it up. So a little bit about John Lilly, introducing that work. John Lilly is a physician late in his life once said that John Lilly is an amazing human being for the fact that being a medical doctor is the least of his accomplishments. He lived a really incredible life, even from a young age. He was called Boy Einstein, was his nickname. And he had the good fortune to have parents who were wealthy enough to buy him lab equipment from a young age, and he was testing down in his basement and doing research experiments. He was also unique in that he is very, you could call it psychically sensitive, or you could call it touched, or you could call it just his brain is wired a little differently than ours. But regardless, he had really intense psychedelic visions from a young age under the influence of nothing. And being raised really extremely Catholic, initially for him, these visions took the form of very religious experiences. One time, sitting in church there during the sermon, the entire roof opened up, and angels and even the face of God was coming down and just visited in front of him, and he felt this wave of peace come over him. And he had this happen several times during his young life. And one of those was actually, he was, those little vibration machines where you stand, they put the belt around you, and they kind of vibrate your body. So John was standing on one of those. And it goes over his erogenous zone. He's 12 years old, and it starts to kind of excite him, and he starts getting an orgasm, and one of his visions strikes, and he just sees these two angelic figures coming down. He's really, again, overwhelmed by this great sense of peace, and feels like God and the angels are reaching out to communicate and try to tell him something. And he goes to church that weekend, and they're talking about the sins of masturbation. And John Lilly decides right there that if what he experienced is a sin, and if that wasn't God trying to communicate with him, that he doesn't want any part of the Catholic Church. So that was the last time that he was really involved in that establishment. What a powerful young dude to make up his mind like that from age 12 with your elders preaching down at you. And there's a couple lessons to take away from that. One is that John Lilly is just an odd and very sensitive human being. Another one is that throughout his entire life, he refused to believe what other people told him, and instead would always trust his own senses and go back to that idea of what he could experience and what he could hear. And just like he kind of distanced himself from the church because his own experience flew in the face of what they were saying, so with his own experimentations into consciousness, into LSD, into Dolphin research, any time that people were telling him things, he refused to go along with it until he had run the studies himself, until he could see that proof in front of his face. And understanding both of those things, I think, is really key to getting a grasp on John Lilly and what he did later in his life. There's another anecdote of him in medical school, his professor walking in, and it's just John Lilly in the classroom with his cadaver cut open and the small intestine stretching across the entire length of the classroom. And the professor goes off on him and says it's disrespectful to the dead, and we shouldn't be doing this, and John Lilly says that he just wanted to measure the small intestine, made sure that it matched up to what the figure they said in the book was. So again, that need to test, that need to prove and understand for yourself. So leading up from a young age, you can think of John Lilly's life up to a certain point, and really up to the end of his research at the National Institute of Mental Health, as being pretty much a straight trajectory, kind of like putting a thread through the eye of a needle. And John Lilly just rose very quickly in the ranks. I believe he only had 2 to 3 papers while he was in school, listed as the secondary researcher or as a collaborator on papers. And after that, all of the over 125 papers that he published, he was the chief researcher on. He was a biophysicist. He was a medical doctor. He studied psychotherapy extensively, both taking it and practicing it. He was a great student of the mind and the body, and beyond that, of consciousness in general. And he studied at Caltech initially. Later on, he went to the University of Pennsylvania, where he was an adjunct professor and eventually a professor. And after that is where he got his money to go to the National Institute of Mental Health, which was the basis for a lot of this. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about John Lilly's early years and leading up to this book and the research that he did here. And that said, he lived such a crazy life. I could easily give 4 different lectures just on the different stages of John Lilly's life. And we might touch on some others, but he's really worth looking into, even beyond what I tell you guys today. And yeah, I could go on for this entire hour just talking about John Lilly anecdotes too. He's led an amazing, incredible life. And again, I'll probably stop short of doing that and give you little facts and readings too. So, what did John Lilly want with his research? Why is he so inspired to actually push forward, and what is he going for? What's he studying? And some people in their lives go along their path without really knowing why they're doing it, what they're going for. John Lilly was not that kind of person. He had a very specific goal in mind. And again, it comes back to his visions, really, when he was a child. And they persisted throughout his life. He, because of this, got really fascinated with the idea of that mind-body duality. Are we just meat carcasses? Do we just have a brain sending out electrical and chemical signals to our body? Or is there something else there? Is there a mind beyond just the brain? And he actually came up with his ideal study to scientifically test this, which is crazy because you always hear about mind-body duality, and I didn't realize before that you could even come up with a scientific test for that. So I'm going to give you a second to just think of what your test would be if you were like, is there something else out there, or are we just a brain? Any ideas, any scientific experiments you could think of to construct? Yeah.
Sensory deprivation.
Good guess. That was actually a ongoing debate, which we'll get into. And he ended up developing the sensory deprivation tanks and especially pursuing research in them after his early tested experiments had gotten subverted a little bit, which we'll talk about. So, and that is a good guess, especially since we're in a float tank center, by the way. Good looking to context. So his idea was, what if we could record all of the electrical, and later he wanted the chemical impulses in the brain on all different levels, and record that for, say, a period of 10 or 15 minutes. His idea eventually ended up being actually to inject hundreds of thousands of probes at all levels into his own brain to 3D map it and record this entire set of signals, and then replay back that 10 to 15 minutes into his brain and see subjectively if the experience was exactly the same, if he just relived those 10 to 15 minutes, or if something else happened, if it was different. And if it was the same, he concluded, we could say that that's it. You know, we are this summary of our chemical and electrical impulses. But if it's different, perhaps there's something else out there. And so leading up to a lot of his work, this was actually still his goal, and he started doing really advanced work with brain probes. He actually ended up inventing the most advanced brain scanners and 3D imaging at the time. And he started playing around with this with monkeys, and later with dolphins. And this, so a little story about that too, which is really interesting, and it leads to why he ended up pursuing float tanks and psychedelics more later in his life. So again, given that this is his goal, and he believed really firmly too in experimenting on himself, just like he only trusts his own empirical information coming in, his own sensory input, he also believed that the duty of any good researcher or doctor is to experiment on themselves before they experiment on anyone else. This didn't include monkeys or dolphins at first. So he started experimenting on dolphins before he experimented, or on monkeys before he experimented on himself. And he started developing brain probes he could actually put into different depths of these monkey brains and start both recording impulses and sending them back there. Later on, he found out how to do this non-intrusively, not the sending of the signals, but he'd put electrodes on and actually get brain scans without being so intrusive. But he starts doing this, and he finds that different parts of the brain are controlling different behaviors and different emotions and different feelings. And not only that, he can control those emotions and those feelings and those actions by reinserting the signals to the part of the brain that's causing them. And so he finds that there are parts that cause pain and nausea, discomfort. There are actually 3 parts of arousal, or of sexual arousal, which is the actual arousal, erection, ejaculation, and then orgasm, separate from ejaculation. And that's important because that's one of the tests he sets up with the monkey. So he hooks up the electrodes, he has a monkey, and they have a lever, which is how you know that it's a science experiment. And whenever the monkey hits the lever, it gets 5 minutes of orgasm in its brain. And then it turns off, and they can hit the lever again. So given this option, what do you think that a monkey given a crazy orgasm button does? Yeah, so they would hit it for 16 hours a day, and then they would sleep for 8 hours, and then they would wake up and they'd start hitting the lever again. So to the point where it was the detriment of their health. They wouldn't be eating, they wouldn't be socializing, they wouldn't be doing the things that they actually need to do as monkeys. So they stopped the experiment. They were actually deteriorating in health. And then they did the same thing with the lever, and they switched it a little bit. So now they have nausea being fed in through their brain probes, or discomfort, and the monkey can stop that by hitting the lever, and it'll stop for 5 minutes, at which point it'll start back up again. And so, same thing, the monkeys just start wasting away after a very short period of time. They can't go more than 5 minutes from the lever. They are constantly chained to it. Sleeping becomes really hard. And they start losing hair and just getting really sickly. And same thing, after just a couple of days, they have to discontinue the experiment with those monkeys. So, John Lilly then wants to play around with animals that have a larger prefrontal cortex and whose brains are perhaps a little closer to human beings, at which point he discovers dolphins and starts playing around with them as well. And one of the things that John Lilly regrets most in his entire life is having dissected, I think it was 3 dolphins early on in his career. And later on, he was petitioning very strongly for dolphins to have the same rights as human beings, and very much believes that it was on par with just murdering 3 people that he did, and felt incredibly bad about it. And I guess the only rationale is just that he didn't know at the time, and that the research that he'd do based on that was how he'd find out. So he does the same test on dolphins, and he starts putting these brain probes into them and giving them the orgasm lever. Any guess what the dolphins do, given the orgasm lever? That is a good guess, the same thing. They'll hit the lever for a while, and then they'll go off and fish, or they'll go off and play with friends, and they'll come back and hit the lever, and go off and do whatever it is that dolphins do during their free time that isn't fishing or playing around with friends. And basically, they just weren't chained to it. They'd use it for recreation, much like we'd go to the movies, or I guess watch pornography or something. And they weren't controlled by it. And similarly, with the pain mechanism, they would stop the discomfort and then go out, but they'd be able to stay away for 45 minutes, an hour. They'd go out and fish. And I'm sure it wasn't pleasant, but they were able to put that aside and just deal with it to get what needs to get done. And it didn't significantly impact their lives like it did with the monkeys, even over just such a short period of time. And I hadn't realized when I first started reading John Lilly, but that's the root of us knowing that dolphins are intelligent and that they have this incredible prefrontal cortex control over their base level emotions. Like, in a very real way, they have instincts just like we all do, but they, like us human beings, are able to control it in a way that even the closest related primates to us are not. At the time that you're allowed to experiment around with. He wasn't doing the brain probes on bonobos, I don't think, for example. So that's a lot of the research that got him into it. And if he'd been able to, I'm sure he would have just continued down that route and gone again towards getting that 100,000 brain probes injected into himself and measuring his ideal test. Except that the government at the time. So John Lilly realized something very important, which is that he was getting money from the government for his research, which meant that it's government research and can be used for government and especially military purposes. And what the military ended up doing was experimenting with attaching electrodes to the heads of donkeys and strapping explosives, payloads, to their backs, and navigating them with the electrodes to turn left or right through long stretches of desert to deliver bombs to remote locations. At which point John Lilly says, that's it, I'm getting out of this, I'm not doing any more of this mind control, brain probe experimentation. I can tell that if I pursue this further, it's only going to be used for terrible purposes that I don't intend it for. And that's the root of a lot of his journeys into the float tank, into psychedelia, into consciousness, meditation, Eastern religion, shamanism. All of that is kind of this route to get to, again, he really wants to know if the mind is separate from the body. But he has to give up that idea of the 100,000 brain probes going in. So I'm going to read another little section from the book right now. This is actually a shorter one. And it leads more into what he's discovering with the float tanks and what he gets into in a lot of the bulk of this. So he says, all human beings, all persons who reach adulthood in the world today are programmed biocomputers. No one of us can escape our own nature as programmable entities. Literally, each one of us may be our programs. Nothing more, nothing less. Despite the great varieties of programs available, most of us have a limited set of programs. And so back in the 50s, he's developing this. In the 60s, 10 years later, is when he actually publishes it. And now, if you look at meta-studies of psychology, of clinical psychology, you'll see that cognitive behavioral psychology is actually among the most effective forms of psychology. And that entire basis for that is around the idea that we have control over our emotions. We feel things, we have that ability to hit the orgasm lever or stop the pain, and we have control over whether we do that. We have instincts, and we decide whether to follow them. And John Lilly's writing this back when that was not commonly thought. We thought that we are our emotions, we have a set personality, often from birth, even if it gets controlled, but we are certain people, not that we are people because we happen to have become that, and we can become whoever we want to be. And that is really what made me fall in love with John Lilly, and why he's one of my personal heroes. And that message carries through in everything that he writes. It's just such a liberating statement, and to be coming from someone who's at the cutting edge of this consciousness exploration and of science at the time. It's just a pleasure, and it's like a breath of fresh air, a breath of very scientifically dense fresh air, reading through a lot of John Lilly for me. So, also at the National Institute of Mental Health, and before this, he was actually doing research into high altitude pilots for the government. So he was designing pressure-controlled chambers to pretty much test the limits of what the human body is capable of, and also nitrogen absorption. And to do this and to test what the human body's thresholds are in different directions, he thought it would be really helpful to have a baseline for that, which is also really hard to get and hadn't been done before. You know, what's the human body acting like when nothing is coming in? And people, again, had hypothesized about it. So some people thought that you'd go unconscious without any stimuli coming in. Your brain would just kind of mellow out and shut down. Some people thought you'd die. Like, that's it. You know, if you don't have stimuli coming in, your brain freaks out and you game over. Some people thought it would just be like laying in a really dark room with nothing going on. You'd get really bored. So in this atmosphere, John Lilly starts developing the float tank. And his first thought is just, okay, let's figure out how to eliminate sense before anything else, because the senses, or that's not sense, the sense of touch. Because the sense of touch is arguably one of the harder things that you could think of to get rid of. So that was his first challenge. And he determines that water is probably the best way to do that, because you can keep it at a really equalized temperature, you get rid of air current. And so he finds this giant big tank, I believe in an old hangar, at the National Institute of Mental Health, the facility where he's working. And he kind of just takes it over and starts experimenting around with it. And I'm sure he told someone, but the way he talks about it, he's like doing it a little bit under the radar, not being too public about what he's doing. And so he figures out what temperature to keep the water at. Interesting side note, we actually didn't know what our external skin temperature was before John Lilly came along. We didn't realize that that was 93.5 degrees. And now having run a float center and knowing that everyone likes the water temperature a little bit different, you know, we all vary, and knowing how much John Lilly liked experimenting on himself, I think that 93.5 degrees is probably John Lilly's external skin temperature, is my own personal hypothesis for that. So regardless, he figures that out. He gets water in the tank. Some of his early tank designs, he actually had gravel surrounding the tank as well, going into the earth so that the vibration couldn't make it in. That's his own form of kind of vibration isolation pads under the tanks. And at the time, his idea was not to lay down in the water. He wanted to be fully submerged in the water, which meant he also needed a breathing mask, and he needed a way to cut out light, which he did 2 in 1. So he experimented around with several different types of masks, which look really creepy. You can look them up online sometime. One of the books, he has photos of them. And he basically ended up, I believe, with a latex mask that covered his face and 2 air holes coming out of it, breathing holes that go into a big tube. And his plan was to have this air tube coming in. He would kind of lay in the water like this, submerged, and cut out all of his senses. In the diagrams, too, the early setups, there's always the safety man observer off to the side, which is Jay Shirley, his compatriot, who would make sure that he didn't die or pulls the plug if like cutting off your senses actually does start to kill you or something. So he hops in, and I mean, you guys know what happens in a float tank, right? Very different than what people had thought. He got out, and his body felt amazing. He felt like he'd just gotten a massage. And John Lilly, I mean, he has visions even when he's not on psychedelics or in a float tank. So he got in there, and he just trips balls. Which also makes me, I always say we're very fortunate that John Lilly is the one who invented float tanks, because had he not been so sensitive like that, we might not have ever gotten to the point that we are today with them. But instead, he got so incredibly fascinated with them. And even then, he played around with them for 6 to 8 years very privately at the institution. Only a handful of people were allowed in to float besides himself. And that was all without LSD that he was playing around with these. Later, he started doing LSD research in conjunction with the float tanks as well. So after that is where we actually get the, it's a nice little anecdote, is actually getting the commercial float tank out of that. So from this crazy device where you're kind of drifting in the water, he ends up giving workshops on constructing your own float tank. And in the 70s, he starts teaming up with Glenn and Lee Perry. Glenn Perry specifically is the one who met him at one of these workshops. And they have a laydown tank at that point, and John is staying afloat in the water, which is just totally non-salt water, fresh water, by bending his legs. It's only about a foot deep still, and doing dolphin breathing, which is where you breathe in and hold your breath, and then breathe out really quickly and breathe back in. So, and then just holding it like that. And so that let his upper body stay floating because it's always filled with air, and his legs bent would keep the bottom half of his body set up. And at some point, they start cranking in ocean water because they realize that you float better in the ocean, and getting a little salt water in there, which helps. And they decide to go to full saturation, because why not, right? If a little bit of salt makes you float, then let's just blast all the salt that we can in here. And that sucked. 25% sodium chloride solution is not comfortable on human skin. And so that's when they switched over to magnesium sulfate and Epsom salt, and that's kind of the full path to get from his weird laboratory immersion, literal tank, float tank, to the float tanks and float pods and float rooms that we know today. So that's all really interesting, and I want to get in, at this point you may be wondering what programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer is, right? We've talked about some brain scans, we've talked about consciousness exploration, we've talked about float tanks. So what does he mean when he says programming and metaprogramming? And we discussed a little bit that idea that we can take control of ourselves. Let me give you an example of one of John Lilly's programs that he starts delving into. So he's talking about experimenting around with LSD and delving into his mind and reprogramming it at this point. He says one such experiment was on a spontaneous occurrence of a phrase during the LSD 25 state, which took on elements of humor and the aspect as if a great discovery. The private metaprogrammatic control instruction is, the key is no key. In the external reality, stimulus for this statement was a number of keys, which the subject had been carrying around for several years. He suddenly became aware that he had in his life many locks. Thus, it was necessary for him to carry many keys. At times, these keys were felt as a physical and mental burden which slowed the efficient operation of his life. These were aspects of the phrase key, which were real keys, real locks on real doors to real rooms, real houses, real offices, etc. At that particular moment, this seemed to be the epitome of modern civilization. To have doors, to have locks on those doors, and have privileged persons who possess the keys to open those doors. The subject next moved from the meanings in the external reality metaprogram to another level in which he internalized this picture of the door, the room, the lock, the key. He visualized his own antithetical metaprograms as existing in rooms separated by doors, which had locks on them. He was searching for the keys to open the doors. As these inner rooms, categories, problems, antitheses, became embodied in the locked door, imagined, projected metaphor, the subject began to walk through the metaprogrammatic storage, looking for a key to open the next door into the further recesses of the rooms. And by that he's really meaning the further recesses of his mind, the further recesses that are locked away from his normal conscious attention. As he moved, he began to see that the doors were defined as doors by his own computer, locks were defined as locks, and that keys were defined as necessary to open the locks. In a moment of insight, he saw that the defined boundaries, the doors, the walls, ceilings, the floors, and the locks themselves and their keys, were a convenient metaprogram dividing up his knowledge and his control mechanism into compartments in an artificial personal fashion. He explored many rooms with many different kinds of knowledge in the rooms. The walls slowly began to dissolve. Some of them then melted and flowed away. Other rooms were revealed as solid, and the doors with secure locks rather numerous. Some keys were missing. And so he goes on from there to talk about that. Although he's able to just, by thinking about it, dissolve these certain rooms and gain access to different memories, he runs across some that even with that idea, that and again, he's creating this framework in his mind on an acid trip, but he is actually at the same time getting access to these memories that he have. And so he approaches it again at a later time. And let's see, so in the multidimensional cognitional and visual space, the rooms were now manipulated without the necessity of the key in the lock. Using the transitional concept that the lock is a hole in the door through which one can exert an effort for a topological transformation, one could turn the room into another topological form other than a closed box. The room, in effect, was turned inside out through the hole, through the lock, leaving the contents outside and the room now a collapsed balloon placed further from the self-metaprogrammer. Room after room was thus defined as turned inside out with the contents spewed forth for use by the self-metaprogrammer. Once this control key worked, it continued automatically to its own limits. And he goes on to talk about how what he found in those rooms that were so heavily guarded was often just nothing, some weird childhood beliefs that he had that weren't even that important, but that had taken on a disproportionate importance later in his life. And probably my favorite part of this entire thing is he goes on to say, these operations were all filed in the metaprogram storage under the title, "The Key is No Key." It was noticed that the necessity for locks and for keys in the real world had to be dealt with. There was an interval of time in which the subject was quite willing to throw all of his keys away and keep all of the real doors of his life unlocked. That was tried briefly and resulted in a theft. So even John Lilly starts realizing that there's a limit to how much you can extend your mental reality into the physical reality from there. So, what do we take away from this? And why is John Lilly writing this book? And what's the context that he's writing it in? Again, this idea that we're taking control of our lives is a lot more common these days. And back then, like he says, it was composed in a rarer time. He was getting government research money for his LSD research, just like he was getting government money for his Dolphin research. And he didn't even think that people who were reading this book were going to take much out of it. He had to be pretty much pressured to publish this in the first place. A large portion of the reason he wrote it was as a summary to his time at this institute. So he wrote it up for a government organization, which is why, again, it's so dense at points. And can you imagine, by the way, writing up things like that to present to the National Institute of Mental Health with what you did for the giant budget that they gave you in your research lab? It's craziness. It's craziness. And so he would go on from there. And I guess really he's writing it to share with them and eventually publishing it and republishing it to share with the world. And again, it's my privilege to have been one of the people affected by that book who just happened to stumble across it and stumble across float tanks. And without this, and without this influencing so many people, Glenn Perry had read this in Center of the Cyclone. He was a programmer at the time. And that's what led him to go to John Lilly's workshop and develop the first commercial float tank. Without this, the float house that we're sitting in right here quite literally wouldn't exist. And we'll get into a little bit about how we got the rights to publishing the book and how we kind of feel like we're carrying on this tradition of reprinting it. But first I wanted to go into a little bit back to that idea of John Lilly's explorations into the mind and body duality and what he ended up eventually establishing with that, because I kind of left that a big open end. So he starts playing around with float tanks. Eventually he starts playing around with LSD in the float tanks. And when he did that for his first time, he actually wasn't interested in it for a very long time. He thought his brain was plenty crazy enough without taking LSD to help heighten it. And he took LSD, he hops in the float tank, and his experience, as you can imagine, is even more profound than previously. At this point, he has a conference he calls it the Conference of the Three Beings, of which he is one of them. So there's two other beings who he encounters. And he talks to them, and they tell him that he should be pursuing this research in float tanks, that he should continue to pursue his LSD research. And I can't remember if it was during that one. They also talk about dolphins and pursuing dolphin research. And he talks about later, too, how these two beings that he saw were the same angels that were coming down to him when he was a child. And they'd visit him throughout his life, I think 3, 4, 5 times throughout different points of his life. A couple near-death experiences that he had, these two beings came down. Later, he'd also say they were actually only one being, but his mind was such that when he was young, he had to picture them as angels. And even later in his life, he had to picture them as two beings because his brain couldn't wrap his head around the fact that this thing was only one being. So he goes back and forth on that as well. He says that that may have just been a machination of his mind, that these beings were generated by, again, the electrical impulses, the chemicals going on in his brain, and that they were nothing more than a good, like basically a subconscious telling him what to do in his life. He changed that opinion, and I believe he changed it back and forth, or at least he wrote different opinions. What he actually believed is, I'm sure, a matter of contention. But much later in his life, he goes back and writes that after having thought about it and having gone through all the things he's experienced, that he now believes that those beings are real, that there are different realms of existence, that if anything, our brain is leaky and has signals coming in from the outside. And more than that there is stuff going on not only on our planet, but in this universe that we just do not and are so far away from understanding. And some of the thought to that is this idea that, I mean, we're advancing pretty quickly right now, right? And given the idea that our universe is tremendously large and that there may be extraterrestrials out there, the idea that if they are out there and if they are more advanced than us, that they are significantly more advanced than us, is not that much of a stretch of the imagination. So he says, okay, if you are as advanced as you can get as an entity in this universe or another one, what do you spend your time doing? And he said, maybe they just try to make things a little bit better. And so he thought that on Earth, they have this thing called the Earth Coincidence Control Office, where these advanced beings kind of control coincidences happening on Earth. And he believed that coincidences in his life were steering him more towards floating, more towards dolphins. Again, he was one of those rare cases where they're communicating directly with him. The Earth Coincidence Control Office is actually tuning in and sending messages to him and talking to him. And he also says later in his life that he was inhabited by energy beings, that through his life there were actually many that came in and visited him in the John Lilly frame that he was and became a part of him and shared that being with him for a while and then left, and he was inhabited by other energy beings. And they were basically like tourists almost, who, again, once you're an advanced energy being, what do you spend your time doing? Maybe you go and inhabit different life forms and see what it's like to live as them, and again, maybe you guide coincidences. And that's actually where we get the name for our publishing company, which is Coincidence Control Publishing. So that was pretty much where he went with it. He actually said that he documented over 200 different realms of consciousness on his ketamine experiences. He actually documented the different stages that he'd get to in his ketamine trips. And he ends pretty much all of them, like he ends this talk about super species metaprogramming, with the highest level being unknown. So it kind of goes self-metaprogramming, species metaprogramming, super species metaprogramming, and up there it's just kind of unknown above that. And that's how he ends his ketamine explorations as well, as in this unknown realm. He documented the different states of enlightenment, of Satori, and hitting that through his different experiences with LSD and kind of combining this idea of Eastern religion with his own Western brain experiments and with psychedelics. And again, his end conclusion, although he couldn't document it as scientifically as he wanted to with those hundreds of thousands of probes going in, I believe was that our mind is actually separate from our body, that there is something else out there. So we got the rights to this book, which was a huge pleasure. I've wanted to publish this since well before I opened a Float Center. And I had no idea how. Like, I don't know how to track down the rights to Lilly's books. And so eventually, fast forward about 3 years, I'd read this, I had in the back of my mind that I want to reintroduce it, because the fact that it's out of print for 25 years really is just a shame. And I started seeing on Facebook, of all things, these John Lilly photos being posted up. You know, John Lilly with Burgess Meredith, John Lilly with Robin Williams, John Lilly with Timothy Leary, and Aldous Huxley, and all of his good friends from throughout the day that he'd kick it with. And I contact him. I write a message to John Lilly on Facebook, and I'm like, well, clearly you're not the real John Lilly. I understand that. How do you have the rights to these photos? And he writes back and says, well, I have the rights because I'm Philip Bailey, the executor of John's estates. And so we start a dialogue and a friendship, and we end up paying him some money for the rights to John Lilly photos, which is how we made this and some of those posters out there. And that springboards into 6 to 8 months later, we started talking about actually getting the rights to programming metaprogramming and seeing what we can do about getting that back in print in its unabridged form. And he let me know that the copy that's out there now, Programming in the Human Biocomputer, was a non-exclusive contract, which is great. So we ended up picking up the rights to reprint this book from the estate. And for the last year to year and a half, I've really been working on, we actually ended up getting everything from the second edition of the book. There were only 2,000. It's like, that's that mimeographed 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. We couldn't find the first edition, which there's only 1,000 copies of around. But we went back and just went through every single copy of the book and started trying to get this as accurate as possible to the original way that John actually wrote it and intended it to be out there. And again, it's my extreme pleasure to actually be able to offer this to you guys and to the world at large. And again, our goal with this is to not only get it out there, but to get it really out there. If we can get John Lilly on the Amazon bestseller list, that would make the decade of my life, pretty much. And that's also why we chose his face for the cover of this book. Is given that we could do anything for the cover, we decided it would be really cool just to get John Lilly's actual visage out there. So if he does become an Amazon bestseller, it'll just be John Lilly staring out at you from the homepage of Amazon, which sounds amazing. So we're going to pass around some clipboards right now as we go into question and answer, and I'll field any questions that you guys have. I'm happy to talk about floating or John Lilly. I'll lie if I don't know the answer. No, I'll tell you that I don't know the answer. And if you guys do want to kind of pledge to order a book when it releases on May 15th, and again, it'll be $12, $13, I think, when it comes out on the 15th, and after that, it'll go up to $19.95 on Amazon. But if you pledge to buy, if you're crazy and you think you have 4 friends who would also like the book, and you pledge to buy 5 copies, we'll give you a free pre-release copy that we have here with us, so you can kind of get a 6th copy for free. If you pledge to buy 2 or more, which is a little less intimidating if you think you can give away even one, we have these kind of beautiful John Lilly posters, which we put up around too. There's a few different ones. My favorite one is actually this one, which is, I love it because, like, why is he holding the gas can? I just feel like he's about to go burn down the establishment or something. It's amazing. I could not believe I found this picture of him. And anyone who just even pledges to buy 1 copy and help support us, we have some excerpts from the book too that you can take home today and start getting a little taste for it. So, and you should see some bookmarks around too, some John Lilly bookmarks, which you can just grab for free if you want to. They're magnetic, which means they've now become my favorite bookmarks. We ordered them, and I just grabbed 100 and like stashed them in my room, and I'm like, I am using these forever. So that's John Lilly's story. That's kind of the story of the history of flotation, of some of the early brain scans, of how we know about dolphin intelligence. And it's also the story of how we came to have the rights to this book and why we're republishing it. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming out and listen to me ramble on and tell some John Lilly anecdotes for a little while. And I'd also like to just open it up for questions if you guys had anything that you wanted to know. Yeah, that's a good call. So the question was, how did I get interested in floating? I actually got interested through one of my good friends, Quinn. And I guess this goes back to a little bit of my background. So I got a degree in experimental psychology. It comes from, is where I come from. And so my friend Quinn, I grew up down in Southern California. I moved up to Portland, Oregon. It's quite a different culture if you know Southern California and you know Portland. And I like Portland a lot more than Southern California, for the record. And I'd moved up there, and Quinn was stuck down in Ventura, California, which, if you're familiar with that, it's just good enough that a lot of people never leave. It's pretty much a vortex. And so I was like, I gotta get you out of there. So I brought him up to visit. He had floated right before he came up to Portland to visit, and he ended up loving it. He applied for a job transfer, and 2 days after that, they told him that he was accepted, but he'd have to move up to Portland in 2 weeks. And he was working there for Verizon, I believe. And he was like, I can't do that. And they're like, okay, 4 weeks max. And so a month later, he's living up in Portland. And he's still working at his tech support job. And he decides he doesn't like it. He wants to get out of it. And we start talking about what to do. I have some entrepreneurial experience, and we start talking about float tanks. And I've never floated at this point, but he had he floated for 3.5 hours his first time down in Venice Beach. Had an amazing experience, and decides that maybe that's worth pursuing. So we do some like I had an envelope, and we were doing back of the envelope calculations on opening a float center, and realized we just know nothing about it. So we started going around and floating everywhere in the Northwest that we can float, which is only, I think, 3 places back then. And so that's how I got pulled into floating. And honestly, had I not started reading the research and looking online and digging into floating and seeing that there's over 200 published research articles showing the benefits of floating, from treatment for addiction to chronic pain to spinal alignment to all of these different things, I'm actually like the worst candidate to get into floating. My brain, as you might tell by my rate of speech, is just always going nonstop. And so I think for most people who are like me, if they go in the first time, they're like, I didn't really get into it. I usually tell them to go back another 2 or 3 times and try it out. For me, it was probably about the 10th to 12th float that I had before I actually really slipped into it and could relax into it, which is really crazy. And I was floating for 2 to 3 hours at a time as well at that point. And it really was, so that was a long answer to the question, but it really was both Quinn and the research that got me into it. And now, having floated well over 100, 200 times, it's a lot easier to relax into it, and it's just affected my life so much for the positive. I can fall asleep at night now. It's really helped with my insomnia. I can actually tell when I'm slipping into a theta state and coming out of it, and kind of decide whether I want to stay awake or go to sleep. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Good question. Yeah, in the back.
How did he spend the last part of his life, the last 20 years? I mean, I was very familiar with him back in the 70s, 80s, and after that, didn't hear anything. So do you have any idea? Where did he retire, in California, or?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot of the specifics of that part of his life. I know some secondhand information. Again, I've been focusing for this talk a lot on his early life. He traveled the world a lot. That's actually where he met Philip Bailey, the executor of his estate. He was his caretaker late in life, so he traveled around to Japan, for instance, and over there. He traveled to Hawaii. He, I believe, did some speaking, but much more than that. When you're John Lilly and you've led such an amazing life, I think what you do for those last 10 years is travel, go around to symposiums, and just kind of experience what you want to experience left in the world. He wrote The Scientist I believe he published The Scientist in '91, which was the last book that he published, I believe. And that gives a good kind of history of a lot of the stuff that he was up to. So later in life, rather than LSD, he was playing around with a lot of ketamine research. And another interesting thing is that John Lilly pretty much just got, I think a lot of the reason that people don't know more about him, again, despite inventing crazy amounts of things, much even more profound, well, arguably more profound for the scientific community than float tanks are, that are still used today. We just don't know about him, and I think the scientific community has really found it convenient to sweep him a little bit under the rug because of his crazy experimentations with drugs. And later in his life, even with his experimentations with ketamine, even the kind of fringe scientists and people who are really out there are saying, no, John Lilly, you've gone too far, and start to kind of turn a cold shoulder to accepting his research that he's putting out there for it, which you can take one of 2 ways for later in his life. Either people are just recognizing more and more that John Lilly was always headed on a path of slight self-destruction, or that he just continually is rising up to another plane of existence than whoever he's associating with. And by the end was just so far above that so many people just thought that he had gone off the deep end. There's stories of him walking into symposiums, into lectures that he'd normally be presenting at, and just kind of rambling on and leaving the room. And some people think that that's a little bit tragic. And to me, that means, again, you have to, it goes back to that idea of stretching the small intestine across the classroom, of disassociating from the Catholic Church. Like, he was an explorer, and he wanted to go into himself and push himself to his limits. And like another great man, Hunter S. Thompson, says, the thing about limits is you only know them when you go over them. Yeah.
Were there any other processes that he expressed around metaprogramming other than the people on the block?
Oh yeah, many. He goes into a lot of those. I mean, so really it's all of them. He talks about unconscious metaprograms that are very self-destructive. For instance, like the unconscious desire, like kind of an unconscious death wish sort of thing, which he talks about the importance of having a supervisor on LSD. There's a chapter in here where he, let's see, note on the potentially lethal aspects of certain unconscious proto-human survival programs. Let's see, yeah, so I'll just read up some of them. Summary of the basic theory and results for metaprogramming in positive states with LSD 25, coalitions, interlock, and responsibility. So again, the program that we are, I mean, he just referred to everything as programs, right? Like we're programmed in the sense that we think that we are the most intelligent species on this planet. When he would say maybe we need to re-metaprogram ourselves to understand that is not necessarily true. I think that, and this is stretching, so the way I interpret a lot of it is to say that again, despite the fact that we are programmable entities, we all have this limited set of programs. We should look around the room and consider it shocking rather than commonplace that all of us talk so similarly, that all of us are dressed so similarly. Given the full extent of what the human brain and consciousness and creativity is capable of, the fact that we adhere so strictly to our species metaprograms and to our own self-metaprograms that should be the surprising thing. And so that's how I end up taking a lot of it. And that can be applied to literally everything, from the way we dress to the way we interact with dolphins, to the way that we take drugs or don't take drugs, to the way that we decide to order books on Amazon on the 15th or not, for instance. Yeah, over there.
Is there anyone who's actually kind of picked up his torch, is carrying his research along?
So the question was, is there anyone who's picked up John Lilly's research as it's going along? And even more than John Lilly himself, especially with there's so many different fields that he experimented around with. There's definitely people still experimenting with dolphin communication and intelligence. There's definitely, obviously, still people experimenting with psychedelics. MAPS recently got the first studies to be approved on both LSD and MDMA, along with psychotherapy, which is really, really nice. And obviously, float tanks are still very much being pushed forward. And there's studies coming out of Sweden on whiplash. There's studies coming out of the United States and actually globally on fibromyalgia. And there's, Justin Feinstein, another researcher, is actually trying to get a full float tank research laboratory set up at his university. And then, separately from that, individually, I think that there are plenty of people outside of the system that are continuing John's research for themselves too.
I just wondered more about governmental kind of applications and these kind of servicing.
Gotcha. I don't know specifically about what's being done with governmental research into it, but yeah, kind of touching on the big theories that he was putting out, all of them, I believe, are still being pushed forward in some way. Oh, yeah, I saw one in the back over there.
In terms of publicizing the book and that, did you think about doing
Crowdfunding?
crowdfunding?
Yeah, so the question was, for publishing this book, did we think about doing crowdfunding? And we did. Honestly, running a float center, and we do a lot of other things too. We do business consulting with new float centers that are starting up all over the world. We design software to run float tank centers. Float House is actually one of the users of our software. We like keeping ourselves really busy. And running a Kickstarter campaign, if any of you in this room have ever done it, takes up a lot of time. You pretty much need to devote a solid 2 to 3 months of your life in order to really get the most out of it. And we just didn't have that kind of time with everything else we have going on. Along with this, we also got the rights to Center of the Cyclone, which we'll probably be reprinting in another 1.5 years. And that's probably John Lilly's most famous, most printed, and most arguably accessible book. And when we do that one, there's a good chance that we'll end up crowdfunding it.
Where did he pass away?
So the question was, where did he pass away? I actually can't remember where he passed away. Yeah, so 2001 was the year. Yeah, I actually can't remember. I'll have to go look that one up. LA? Okay.
Maybe talk a bit more about what he, the programming, metaprogramming. I think that's kind of a subjective term for people, like maybe from your psychology background. Like,
Sure, sure.
Examples.
So let's actually just kind of go through, he has a nice diagram in here. Let's see if I can find it really quick. He talks a lot about what the stages of that are. Here we go. So it goes up. So he starts at stage 1, right? And by the time you get up to programs, we're at stage 6. So stage 1 is biochemical, chemical, physical, external reality. Like what is actually going on in the physical world, even if we're not ever fully aware of it, like that is external reality, right? A step above that is biochemical body, the sensory body, the motor body, the vascular body, what's going on in our body. Above that, the biochemical brain, the neural brain, so what's, quite again, literally like the impulses that are going through there, the hormones that are going through. 4, biochemical activity, neural activity, glial activity. 5, subroutines and subroutine stores. And so this is where it starts getting into programming. And so the subroutines in the subroutine store, that's the details of the instructions. So for instance, tying your shoe, that would be a subroutine, right? Something that you just have down pat. For us running a float tank center, cleaning off the salt, turning on the pump, at some point that just becomes second nature. Programs, detailed instructions. So if the subroutines are the details of the instructions, the programs are the detailed instructions. So that you need to put on your shoe in the morning is the program. How to do that and the tying of it would be the routine. Metaprograms above that is the programs that program a set of programs. So if you think, for instance, that it's important in life to share information and that you'd rather get more information out there rather than hoarding it to yourself and think that information is power and so I should be holding on to it, that will control many, many other programs well beyond that one. It will control, for instance, reprinting books, deciding to do consulting for float tanks, relating it back to my own life because this is off the cuff and that's how I work well. And so metaprograms, again, end up being that step where it's programming other ones. So then you get into self-metaprograms, and that's awareness. This idea that we are in charge of ourself. Above that, supra-self metaprograms, that's to be metaprogrammed, someone else from the outside world programming you. So advertisements that you see around, public service announcements, just conversations with friends that really influence you, that's a supra-self metaprogram. And then supra-species metaprograms, so programs that are programming our entire species at a time and influencing, again, why all of us are so similar within this room. And then above that, stage 11, unknown. So I don't know if hopefully that broke it down a little bit more from you, but from a straight just external reality into our body, into our mind, into our programs, metaprograms, our species, the unknown, that's pretty much what he means by all of it. Yeah?
In this book, does he get into processes of, I guess, gaining awareness of those programs or even creating your own for yourself, sort of like, I guess, a cognitive behavioral therapy of the sort?
He does. If that's specifically what you're interested in, there's a lot better books that are written now for getting into that. And so it's really funny reading some of this. He talks about a lot of those that he discovered on LSD. And some of them read just straight like trip reports. Only he's one of the first people documenting and experimenting around with LSD trips. And so he writes it like it's these general experiences that everyone's going to have on the drug, when really it's this very personal kind of trip. Although I also have had that experience with keys and just being like, I hate them, I hate all keys. This is so the world right now. So you can read a lot of the things that he writes about in here as a guidebook for how to do that, either in the tank, on psychedelics, or off the influence of anything. And you just have to understand that you need to take them with a grain of Epsom salt or something like that, and realize that this is written back in the 60s, that the fields, pretty much all of the fields that he's talking about are being developed, or he himself is creating, and they did not even exist beforehand. Yeah?
Instance control office, is that level 11? Is that level 10? Does it go deeper than that?
That's a good question. I would probably say that the Earth Coincidence Control Office would fit into supra-species metaprogramming, or unknown. But I'm not sure, actually, where John would fit that in the spectrum. Yeah, in the back over there. So the question was, where do astral out-of-body experiences fit into all of this? So you mean into the programming spectrum, or it's kind of like his most famous quote that John Lilly has, where he says that in the province of the mind, whatever you believe to be true becomes true. or is true within certain limits to be found experientially and experimentally. These limits are further boundaries to be, what's the last word in that one? Transcended. And he believed, so the idea of astral projection, I think he would argue that you can't even do it if you don't believe in it. And he was very into, even if he would go, so he'd go down to these, crazy retreats, he'd go to ceremonies, he'd take large amounts of psychedelics, and his stance was that you need to believe it fully while you're doing it, like 100%, And so he would throw himself into these belief systems and become a part of them. And then later, after having gone through it, he would extract himself from those and then try to objectively look back on it and report on what his experience was while he was subjectively just 100% in that field and in that moment. And so I would say that that's where his journeys to all of these different, I think over 200 different realms that he actually documented and said existed out there and had traveled to and from, came from. And so I would say where it fits in is that understanding this and believing that anything is possible is the first step towards experiencing those, whether or not they go down to that stage one and are actually happening in the external world. Even just experiencing them subjectively or objectively, you need to get yourself to the point where you're programming yourself and able to get past whatever hangups you have on that. Yeah?
Have you found yourself benefiting from reading him in terms of your own programming? Have there been programs of your own that you've debunked or reprogrammed?
That's a great question. So the question was, as a result of reading John Lilly, are there any programs that I myself have debunked? And there almost certainly are. I, again, come from this background in experimental psychology. So even before I knew about John Lilly, I had studied behavioral programming, cognitive behavioral psychology. And I've very much believed throughout my entire life pretty much what John said. Again, so picking him up, I'm just like, yes, you're right, and you were writing so long ago. So probably less impact for me than someone who just hasn't been exposed to these ideas. But that said, especially having gone through now, not just reading it, but poring over every sentence and looking for comma errors and just really delving through this text over the last year, it's really driven it home that, like he says, these are further things to be transcended. No matter how deep you're going into all of this, like there's always a level that you can go where you're like, you are so prejudiced and so biased and so programmed by everything around you and you don't even realize it. So yeah, it's, if anything, just encouragement to constantly be pushing those boundaries and to take nothing within yourself or that is yourself for granted. Awesome, guys. Well, thanks so much again for coming out. This is an extreme pleasure. I love telling John Lilly anecdotes. It's my favorite things. I have even more of them if you want to catch me after this. And I'll actually be around Vancouver. I'm taking tomorrow off the book tour. I've been going straight for 4 days now. On Tuesday, I'll be up in Whistler. But I'll be around Vancouver for, today and tomorrow. So if any of you feel like getting together or grabbing a drink or anything, I'm very open to that too. I don't have any plans while I'm here except to do a podcast with the Zarimba brothers. And again, thanks so much for coming out. And enjoy the experience of John Lilly.